Our movements are tracked, our tastes and likes, every click of everything we do online is being tracked. Everyone in America is being surveilled.
We have succumbed to the notion that we should give up our anonymity. Your anonymity is such a gift.
Increasingly, we're recognizing that a lot of the tools we use every day are rooted in data that are both very old and very racist.
I don't think that the everyday civilian is aware of the role that algorithms are playing in our day-to-day lives.
If an algorithm is involved in you not getting something important, like insurance or some other thing, you have the right to know.
There are many possible different definitions of discrimination or unfairness. Some of them conflict with each other. The first one I always ask is one group experiencing a positive outcome at a higher or lower rate than another group?
Wow, what a trailer. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. My name is Xavier Harding. I'm on the content team here at Mozilla Foundation. And today we're talking about AI and bias, how software and tech we use every day is a little more racist than you think. Joining me on today's panel is Abeba Burhain, Senior Fellow here at Mozilla Foundation, focusing on trustworthy AI. Amir Adala, former Mozillian, current Consumer Reportsian, as shown by her background. Kasia Shemlensky, Consumer Reports Fellow and co-founder of the Data and Nutrition Project, which you should definitely check that out if you haven't, because it's like really cool. I'm excited to chat today about AI and bias. And one last thing, we're taking questions for this panel in real time. If you're watching on LinkedIn or YouTube, you can use the chat function to add your questions, or you can tweet them at Mozilla Festival with the hashtag dialogues and debates. But yeah, wow, what a trailer. How's everyone doing today?
Good, great. It's sunny and beautiful here in Dublin.
That's awesome. Yeah, same here in New York. Yeah, let's talk about AI and bias. So maybe we should kind of start with some background primer questions. What's something that folks who follow this space closely already know, but something that many folks may not know when it comes to how tech and software can be biased? Maybe we start with Abeba, since the weather is so nice over there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I have a feeling almost everybody that has heard of the word AI is also familiar with bias, but you can't assume that. I guess bias is a very general, abstract term. It refers to, it could be discriminatory outputs, it could be a racist classification, it could be hateful content, it could be a number of things. And in a way, I have grown to dislike the term bias itself because it's too abstract. Any discriminatory outputs or any hateful content, when we label it as bias, it seems a bit far. It seems a bit distant. It seems a bit dissociated from the actual concrete impact it has on actual people. So these days, actually, over the past couple of years, I have come to prefer the terms. If I am, for example, examining a data set for, racist stereotypes or for gender stereotypes, I prefer to use precise terms like racist or sexist or ableist, as opposed to just using the general bias. But sometimes you can't avoid that. You have to use just the word bias. But yeah, bias is a general term used to refer to harmful, problematic, racist, otherwise discriminatory and problematic outcomes in models and labeling and classification in models in data sets. And often, the mislabeling, the racism, the sexism often impacts people that do not conform to the status quo. So people that are outside, what's seen as the normal sex or the normal gender, or people that are non-white are often those that pay the heaviest price when it comes to, these AI systems that we are building. They all fail. There will always be failure. There will always be problems. And when those problems happen, when those issues arise, as I said, people at the margins of society are the ones that are most likely to be negatively impacted by bias or by sexist, racist, ableist, or otherwise problematic outcomes.
Yeah, I love that point you made about just being not just saying bias, but being very specific about what it is, because you can't really, cure the problem unless you diagnose it like very specifically. So kind of on that tip, maybe I can shoot this question to Kasha. So what are some not so obvious examples of how tech can not just be biased, but be racist or be homophobic? What are some examples of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And thanks for having me. It's an honor to be on a panel with such esteemed colleagues. So this question of kind of what's not so obvious. I mean, I think that something that maybe not everyone knows is that issues can arise at multiple points in the life cycle of AI. So starting from, the data that's collected or not collected. So that's kind of a maybe not so obvious thing, as well as when you're talking about representation of a training data set. So, the data that's going to be fed into a model that model will be trained on. It's not just about who is included, it's also about who's not included. And I totally agree with Abeba that it's not so much, the word bias is not so helpful because there's no such thing as a perfect data set. And so it's not really about removing bias or bias mitigation. It's about understanding the bias of the data set, because there always will be one. And it's about, identifying what that bias is, naming it precisely, then mitigating, if that's something you want to mitigate. Because sometimes we're actually looking for a bias in the data set in order to make a decision. And so I think that's one, you could start all the way from the data, then you move into how the model is trained. I think, it's a really big deal to think about the objective of the model and the feature selection, the way that it's actually been tweaked and trained to give you a certain kind of outcome. So for example, if you're trying to predict crime and all you have is arrest data, you're really just going to predict where people are arrested. And that we know can be a proxy for communities that are over-policed or policed more than others, or where people are arrested more. So it's a really big deal to also think about how you're actually training the model, what the objective is of the model. And then finally, how that model is deployed into the world, how it's released on which communities, and whether that model is then tracked in production, looking at certain metrics to make sure it's not drifting off of what it was initially created to do, because the world is changing, or because the model itself is shifting somehow. So I think that there's, it's helpful to kind of consider the full life cycle of how these models are created, from the data all the way to the production, kind of the deployment, and then ultimately the retiring of models, which we should talk about. And bias and harm can really arise at any point in that cycle, and does.
Yeah, I'm still actually kind of stuck on the first thing you said in that response of just like, these systems that we make will always have bias. It's just a matter of, accounting for that. Think about how you can have a clock in your house that's 2 minutes wrong, but knowing that it's 2 minutes wrong, you can keep that in mind and account for it. So knowing that these systems are biased, if they're going to be biased no matter what, because humans are fallible, I think knowing that, okay, it's going to be this wrong, it's going to over-represent Black folks in its data set for who they think criminals are. So accounting for that as humans sounds like what we have to consider as we use these things. So I want to talk about the trailer we just watched. I want to talk about bad input. For Amira, it's funny, the question I wrote down is what made you want to create a series like this? Maybe it wasn't just you who made this. What made Consumer Reports and the Kapoor Foundation want to make a series like this?
Yeah, thank you so much, Xavier, and also excited to be amongst this panel talking about these issues that are so important. When Consumer Reports and Kapoor Foundation really ideated on this, our plan was to create short-form documentary-style videos addressing the harm and biases and algorithms that result in unfair practices towards people, and often without them knowing. And we did that through a racial equity lens because we felt that that was really important, and we really wanted to create media for that community, for those communities, so that we could give them the tool set and the kits that they need to be able to advocate forward. So when we did that, we decided to bring along a lot of researchers and experts with us from DARE, ACLU, University of Michigan, amongst others, to feature them in the film and their important work in the hope that we could use the films to really drive public awareness, action, and better policies as a whole, so that we can work on understanding these issues. So much of what Abiba and Kasha have already said, really understanding the full life cycle of where algorithms are impacting people, how we need to reframe our thinking about them. And if we do know that they're going to have bias throughout that life cycle, what are we going to do to actually implement solutions throughout that cycle to mitigate or address those biases that will come up? And so that was really exciting for us. And it's really exciting to showcase and share those films with everyone. And we really wanted to focus on 3 core issue areas that Consumer Reports has had a long history of advocating for, whether it's on financial fairness, helping people make healthy choices, or testing and reviewing internet-connected devices. These are areas we have a lot of research and reporting on, but more than that, these are areas that people really depend upon at some point in their lives. And we wanted to showcase how algorithms are already playing a role in the areas you depend upon, because you rely upon loans for your businesses or your homes, and we rely upon hospitals and medical products to keep us safe and healthy. And we rely upon governments and police forces to keep us safe. And if these systems are using faulty and often inequitable technology in ways that are really harming communities, we need to know about it, and we need to move people to act about it.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe we can talk more about the topics chosen for this series, 'cause I love how realistic and down to earth and like actually like how it applies to people's real lives, how they are that way. Maybe we can talk about that. I think mortgage lending and facial recognition. What are all the topics?
Yeah, so we did 3 short form documentaries, and the topics included looking at home lending, so mortgage lending, loan lending, and generally just financial services. And then the second video actually really details into medical devices, which look at everything from pulse oximeter, which used a wide set of data. To your first question, I think when people don't often realize how technology can be biased, a lot of the algorithms and technical products right now use mass amounts of data. In some cases, they need to be able to use data that exists, that has been around for a very long time. And what we're finding is those data sets are often old and outdated, which means they are racist, classist, sexist, amongst others. And we really wanted to show that in both how that data has been used in a product form, but also how that then lends itself to algorithmic outputs in a digital form, and where we're looking at now. And the third one really looks at facial recognition. So how we've been trained to not think a lot of when we unlock our phone with facial recognition technology, but then how something as innocent as that has led to a much bigger process around facial recognition and surveillance in our country, in countries around the world, which have deeper impact on communities.
Yeah, sometimes I worry about, I mean, Apple has a lot to say about how the face data you put into your Face ID doesn't leave the device, but at the same time, I always worry a little bit about like the desensitization, that's a word, right? Of just us being so comfortable with, oh, Face ID, facial recognition, face unlock, we just do it so many times a day. I don't know if you worry about that too, but I think about that sometimes.
I worry about that all the time. I think we often lean into, in our world right now, things that are convenient and fun without thinking about the impacts that they have either on communities around us or in our lives in the future and what they lead to. And I think a lot of the design process on thinking about things in intentional ways require us to reframe how we see that technology being used, not necessarily for us, but potentially against us.
Yeah. I want to shift a little bit and give folks the space here to brag about the great work that they do. And I want to start with Abeba for this once again. So a lot of the work you do centers around audits of large-scale data sets. What exactly does that mean, and what's the benefit of that for regular people?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So auditing your data sets, auditing your model, auditing everything is really important because data sets are really critical. They're the backbone of AI. If you think about it, a lot of the, deep learning techniques, a lot of the AI techniques we have now are not new. These are something that have been around since the 60s, 70s, 80s. What really made the deep learning revolution, or what really made the AI boom over the past 10, 15 years is the availability, I say availability in quotation mark, or the availability of large scale data sets because of the internet, because everybody's, exchanging texts that's then mined and assembled into a large, natural language processing data set. As we, share images, upload our selfies into various spaces in the World Wide Web, that then is kind of harvested and put together, assembled together, and then used as a training material for vision systems. So it really is the internet. It really is, us, the regular people, through our interaction on over the World Wide Web, that really that has become significant in making available these huge millions and billions. Data sets are in billions now, especially over the past year, especially what's known as multimodal data sets. These can be, image and text pairs or other modality pairs. These are used to train some of the latest models like Stable Diffusion or Midjourney, or even, models like DALL-E, OpenAI's DALL-E. So data really is the backbone that made the AI boom possible. And because a lot of the data that's then becomes assembled into large-scale data sets is sourced from the internet, and because the internet reflects, or because the internet is created by, each individual, all of us, humanity, it always, without exception, encodes, historical injustices, historical problems, or our norms, our conventions, and the stereotypes that guide our everyday move. So that's why it's really important to delve into our data sets, no matter how large they are, because data sets are getting larger and larger. It's becoming really difficult to kind of take a closer look. If you want to manually, for a human to look at, one of the large scale data sets that's used for training, it would take years probably now, because they are vast. So given that data sets are the backbone of AI models, and given that data sets always come from the internet, almost always, sometimes I leave a little bit of exception. And given that data sets almost always are sourced from the internet, meaning that they always encode societal stereotypes, biases, and historical injustices, it's really important to delve in and take a look at, how our, identity concepts, cultural concepts, how our these kind of things represented in the data set, and as Kasia said, what's missing as well as what's in there. So good quality data, audited data, necessarily means better, better performing, better functioning, and just an equitable AI. So yes, so it's really important. I think a lot more people should be doing auditing work, especially data sets.
As you say that, I think what comes to mind in my mind is, we have all these interactions online, and so many of our interactions are digital, and many people may not even realize that everything they're doing online is being swept up in this sort of way. And I wonder, should I be worried about like the consent model there? Like, I may not be interacting online in a way where I'm like, and I'm also giving a consent for people to, train their AI models with what I'm doing online. I wonder if people would act differently if they knew that the robots of the future would be being based on the behavior of right now. But B, should I be worried about that? Should that be the least of my worries? Like, should I feel weird about that?
Well, here's the thing. Some of your images are probably very likely in some data sets. That's like not just you, all of us. I've through my own personal work, I've found my own images and other, close friends and colleagues in some of like the biggest, most celebrated data sets. So I would not be surprised if, your images are not in data sets, and we should be. And here's the thing, because the field is moving so fast, and regulation is kind of not moving as fast, we are in a messy space where, on the one hand, at least according to GDPR, we should be, any data that's kind of sourced from the web should be done with the consent and awareness of the data subject themselves. That's one of the minimum, the least criteria, but that doesn't happen. If you look at, a data set curation process within the machine learning AI space, that's not the norm. In fact, that's why, some of these, some of the upcoming startups and companies that are blowing everybody's mind, companies like Stability AI and Journey, are in trouble. They are getting they are getting into a lot of legal problems for copyrighted material, for scraping sources, for scraping data without consent of especially big companies, like companies that sell stock images like Getty. So we will see a lot more of this. So we should be worried, because any images or our textual exchange that we are sharing over the internet doesn't necessarily grant others to kind of harvest it and use it as a training material. So there is a kind of a culture shift, and we shouldn't normalize that. We shouldn't get comfortable with that just because that's the norm at the moment. Just because that is what people are doing at the moment doesn't mean, it's right.
I need to go to my Instagram account and take a very good look at what photos I've been tagged in, because apparently it's been being used in ways I didn't realize, or I don't think about often enough. I want to kick it to Kasha, because I want to talk on this topic of data collection, about some of the work that you do with Data Nutrition Project. When it comes to data collection, when it comes to how we think about how companies gather our data, what are we doing and what should we be doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wholeheartedly plus one everything that Abeba was saying about cultural norms and not becoming complacent with the existing norms, and thinking of, trying to think about if we could build the world that we want to see and have the kind of control over our data that we want to have, what would that look like, right? And how can we move ourselves towards that? I think as consumers, we don't have a lot of power right now, just not to make everyone feel depressed about it. There are some really amazing projects that are in the space. I guess I'll plug CR's, I think it's called Permission Slip. That's an app that they've recently released, and it's really cool. You can go in and say, I would like to request that my data be removed from all of these different platforms, and actually they'll go and help you try to remove your data. So I think that there's kind of awareness and education that we as consumers, I think we should spend more time considering and sharing with our friends and telling our loved ones about, making sure that you really know where your data is going, and occasionally prodding companies to see if you can get your data out. I do think that there's kind of a rising tide floats all boats type of a metaphor, that I hope that as awareness increases with consumers, that this will create pressure on companies to provide more ways for people to access their data, or the right to have your data out or to be removed from the server. And also, I hope that will encourage folks to push for regulation in the space. A few things just off the top of my head. I think that we have a right to know if we're interacting with an AI or the results of an AI. And we also, as companies or purchasers of AI systems, should have a right to know how that data was, or what data was used to train that AI. At the Data Nutrition Project, which is a 501c3 that I co-run with some very fantastic interdisciplinary folks, we're thinking about tools for transparency and accountability to provide some visibility into the underlying data that's used to build these systems. So we build nutritional labels for data sets. The metaphor is that, just like you can look inside a box of cookies before you eat it, you should be able to look inside the data set before you use that data to train a model. So you should be able to identify issues before you train the model, which sounds crazy that you would wait until after, but that's kind of how it happens right now. And so, our belief is that these kinds of labeling systems, this kind of documentation as a mechanism for transparency, should be on all of the data sets that are used to train models, and you should be able to have access to those labels so what actually the model was trained on. And I think that the last thing I'll mention is, we're very focused on the model as the product, And I think that we need to expand our definition of what the product is to include the underlying training data. And for whatever reason, just in terms of cultural norms, we are interacting with the product at the model level. So if you're in the government, you're procuring systems, you're also interacting with the black box, which is the algorithm. We need to expand that to include the way that it was trained and the data that it was trained on as part of the product. And we should have a right to understand what it was trained on and how it was trained. So I'll pause there, but those are some things I think that we should consider.
No, I mean, don't feel the need to pause, but I'm glad that you're engaged in a project like that. I remember thinking whenever I started to learn about all the things that these companies do with our data, I was like, why does the FTC not require these companies to like have a nutrition facts style label of like, you're going to be involved in this, and that. You must feel pretty good when you see, I feel like I've seen a lot of companies who have adopted that idea as well, like on the iOS App Store, you can now see like data linked to you, data that's not linked to you. How have you felt seeing that idea that you have kind of take life in other ways, in other forms?
I mean, I have to say, even just in our calling it a nutrition label, we're borrowing from best practices in other industries. So I think it's, we're not the only ones who have this idea, and the notion of standardized documentation is something that lots of people have considered in the space. So we're thrilled that people agree that this is something that is useful and that it is a mechanism for transparency. A lot of people say, oh, transparency, accountability, fairness, these are such broad principles. How can we ever actually do them in practice? I think documentation, auditing, transparency has mechanisms, and there are corollaries in other domains. And we're borrowing from that, and we're excited to see that others are doing so too.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Oh, we got an audience question, and I think it's really interesting. I wonder what you all think. So the question is, I wonder if some folks are taking a more adversarial, this is in regards to data collection and training AI based off of interactions of folks online. This question is about how current behavior is impacting future AI actions. I wonder if some folks are taking a more adversarial approach, basically performing potentially malicious action that is being accepted by the AIs as legit. This is in regards to what we were talking about before about how we train AI models based on online interactions. What do you all think when you hear that question? What comes to mind?
I'll jump in, although I don't do any adversarial learning. Yeah, so this is not in context of adversarial approach, but in context of my own work. Yes, I mean, when you delve into data sets, not so much, but models, almost all models are brittle. It's very easy to trick them. I know a bunch of work from colleagues of mine where, working through computer vision systems. That means, using millions and millions of images to train a machine learning system to recognize, say, a bus or a car or something. And then you change a tiny bit of the pixel that a human eye wouldn't even be able to recognize, then that model will switch its answer. It will, when you give it, say, for example, an image of a bus with a tiny part of the pixel changed, it will switch to labeling it as a giraffe or ape or something. So I know this is a very broad and a robust and really fast expanding area. So I'm just saying I'm aware of this kind of adversarial trainings, but I don't do them in my own work. Whereas speaking from my own experience of dataset audits, for example, we've in one of my recent works, we've found that now that everybody's really crazy about scale, you really have to scale up. Everything has to be bigger and bigger and bigger. Each company, for example, take, Meta or Facebook or OpenAI and Google and DeepMind, they are all like neck to neck in competition who produces the bigger, larger model. Scale is these days taken as, everything. So one of the things we did in one of my recent work was as the scale increases, in data sets, do other problematic content in data sets, does that also increase? So we audited two similar data sets, but one is smaller, one is 400 million image and text pairs, the other one is 2 billion image and text pairs. And we had 3 categories, hate speech, aggressive speech, and I'll come back to the other one. And what we found was, as the data set increased, the amount of hateful content that's in the data set increased significantly. So what we realized through audits of these data sets is that you can't always guarantee, you are safe to assume that a given data set that is harvested, that's collected from the web, will always encode problematic, problematic norms, problematic stereotypes. It will also, it will also have so much content that is so useless, that is so poor quality, you just have to throw it out. So it's not just a matter of negative stereotypical representation or harmful content, it's also a matter of quality. A lot of, the image or text data that's harvested without, some kind of filtering or auditing is useless. So through auditing for hate speech, what we found was that, yes, as we rush for scale, for bigger and bigger, we also find that, hateful content and problematic stereotypes also exacerbate with the scale.
Yeah, Mira, I want to get you in here. It's been a while since we've kicked it to you.
Well,
what do you think when you read this?
I actually really appreciate this question, and I'm going to approach it from a meta standpoint and take it back to the data, because every move we do online is a data point. Everything we click, everything that happens. And the truth is, we don't have a lot of control over that data. And that data is often being used, harvested, in some senses taken for money and purposes where it's made to understand our behavior, to make money off of it and convince us to do things we wouldn't normally do. That's a whole world of deceptive design that we're not talking about today. But the whole point I really want to make here is just that there are people who are leaning into the short-term benefits of sharing and using and the data. And there's people, I think mainly people here right now, who understand the long-term impacts of that data, and who are making changes as a result of that. And so when I think of potentially malicious action, or even some people who know that data sets or data is being calculated in all these ways, they're starting to spread out where data happens or what's happening. And just as a quick example, in New York City, they implemented a process where you could take the train by just using your credit card. That is all data. Every one of those points is data that's being harvested and sold. So what someone like me is doing is oh, that's really convenient when I need it, but I don't want to rely upon it. So I alternate between my credit card and my Metro card, so they don't have enough of knowledge of where I'm going and what I'm doing. And so I think that there's ways in which we're understanding the system, and we're actually doing perhaps the adversarial approach, but also just understanding how that data is being used against us, because we don't have control. So that's one way I feel like I have control. And I think that all that goes into kind of training these data sets, and perhaps every question you ask in a chat GPT setting is being used to train the data set. And so understanding, well, what is that question going to say about me or about what that data is going to learn? And so I do think there's a movement of people who are understanding that there is a way to trick it and not fuel it with everything we know and every piece of data we have, and we're moving in that space, but it's still very small.
I need to underscore the first thing you said. Every move we make online is a data point. That is so true and crazy and true and scary, I think, because we're not really putting much thought into the things maybe that's really revealing for me. I'm not putting a lot of thought to the things I do, but I guess I am in certain ways. But you don't think that it has that it carries that weight every single move you make. Also, the MetroCard tip is a great idea. I'm always looking for ways to muddy the data water so I can hide my tracks. So
I mean, it's convenient, but at a cost is the hard part of all these things. So it's convenient for you, and it makes it a lot easier to not miss a train if you can quickly just swipe your credit card. But at the same time, that's like a data point that's being calculated on you that is somehow potentially going to be put into a data broker or elsewhere that will do something that I'm not sure of and I'm not comfortable with.
Oh yeah, and then unfortunately, what we see is like the folks who can afford to have better privacy. Sometimes it comes at like the cost of like literal costs. Like not everybody has multiple cards they can go back and forth between. Like some people may not have that option, so it's kind of scary the world we're building.
Can I just quickly add, beyond the individual being tracked, it also has a much bigger impact on society, because as we are datafying every move, we are creating a surveillance society where everything is mapped into data, where everything is, classified, categorized, where every move, every behavior of individuals and communities is then kind of predicted. So, from the metro card that you mentioned, Amir, to the vacuum cleaners that we might have in our own home. These are tools that are kind of measuring and tracking and mapping our own living space to maybe the CCTV cameras that are fitted with some kind of facial recognition technology that we might see in the apartment block that we live in, to the location tracker on our own phone. These are all, bit by bit, step by step, all in the name of convention. We are creating a big kind of a giant surveillance society where there is nowhere for us to hide, where there is no place of sanctuary, where we can't just have a break from being tracked and monitored and surveilled. So it does have a much larger chilling effect on society. This means that if you are about to go out and protest against your government, the fact that knowing that you are likely being tracked and monitored might have some kind of impact on you. It might impact your job, if, for example, if you are searching for a job. So it does have, it's not just creating a surveillance society, it does have impact on how we behave and how we act and what kind of society we become as well.
Oh yeah, every very rarely once in a while I'll like miss cash, because cards are one thing, but cards are very trackable. Metro cards are very trackable, but like cash, I don't know. So wait, Kasha, did you want to get to this?
Yeah, just to say that, I think one of the narratives that to me is a false narrative from industry is that people don't mind giving up their data because they get valuable things in return, like ads or personalized recommendations or these kinds of things. And I think that to me, you mentioned earlier, Xavier, the privacy labels that Apple launched, and they launched an option, a consumer option to say, do you want to be tracked or not? And a vast majority of people said, number one, I'm being tracked. Number two, no, I don't want to be tracked. And so I think that to me is kind of like this amazing test in production that highlights that people will make a choice for privacy when they know they have one. And so even though the narrative out there is, hey, personalized stuff, everyone wants it. Everyone wants something that's more custom and more personalized to them. I guess my pushback is we should have the choice. So we should know what that trade-off is, and we should be able to opt in or opt out, depending on the service.
That's such a good point, because even just presenting the choice is informative in that way. Like you said, like, oh, I didn't realize I was being tracked. I don't want to be tracked now that you mention it. I want to go back a little bit to bad input, and I have a question for Amira. So we've seen a lot of movies on the topics of algorithmic injustice. I think a lot of us watched The Social Dilemma. Mozilla has a documentary as well. What needs to be done to make sure these movies, these documentaries actually lead to change?
Yeah, it's a big question, to be honest. Traditionally, like films and movies have been used to broaden our perspective and help us understand problems in new ways. And I truly believe, as whether they've been conversation starters or really understanding different viewpoints. Everything from Social Dilemma, Coded Bias, Mozilla's videos, and others have been a really important part of that movement. And I call it just that. I call it a movement. When Coded Bias came out, Kash and I did a panel together that was titled, How Do We Push Forward the Movement of Algorithmic Justice? Because we need people to start having these conversations, and we needed more people to get together to talk about these things. And while our intent at Bad Input was to share a new perspective and understanding that people were really going to be able to take forward, what we need is more content, more media, more ways people can really grasp onto this and see and feel themselves as part of that narrative, whether it is issues that are potentially impacting them or ways in which they're seeing communities they care about at the center point, or just like understanding that long-term impact of things like data, like what we're talking about. I have no doubt that everyone here understands like the short-term gain, but versus the long-term impact of data. But as much as we do a lot of survey research at Consumer Reports, and over 70% of people are genuinely terrified of what will happen, what happens to their data and the amount that private companies and governments hold on data about them, they're really unsure of what that looks like and what sort of impact that will create. And so whether it's currently addressing these issues in the videos, or looking at futuristic ideology of what could that world look like, or what that world would look like if we changed and did things differently. I think that there's still a lot of media coverage that we could have on these issues, and we need a lot more so that we bring more people along and make sure that they understand them and can advocate with them. And I think that's really exciting in this perspective with launching Bad Input as another toolkit or set for people to leverage. But I do want to just return back to the fact that it's a movement, and we need people to move with us. So whether it is videos, whether it is petitions, we need things in the movement that allow people to continue on and have the change that they want to see. I do believe firmly in people power. I think it's going to be one of the biggest powers of this specific movement. Maybe I'm a little bit of a cynic on regulation, but I think it also could be a lever. Whether it's happening, that's another question. And so I think we need the focus for us is we need people to understand so that they can advocate for that change. And that we've seen historically in a lot, like forever, people have done that. And so at this point, we need better ways for people to understand and work that forward. And I think all the films have done a great job at least starting the conversation, having people ask the right questions. I think that's the crucial part. We're asking questions that we've never asked before. And if we can continue to do that and continue to understand what are the questions, instead of just not being accepted for a loan, but like, why wasn't I accepted for the loan? Why can I approach the bank, and can I talk to them and add some level of transparency as to why this didn't happen, to understand what were the data that was used against me, potentially outside of my control. And what we're seeing now is potentially a move for more people actually taking litigation responses when their home has been appraised in a way that was racist and hindering economic opportunity for communities of color, or if an algorithm potentially made a decision for them that they weren't aware of, or that they had that was outside their control. And if we can make more of a movement in that sense, and have people ask the right questions and push for the right solutions, we can see people taking that next step. And I think that is crucial to what these films are providing.
Give me the nutrition facts label as to why I didn't get that loan. That's what I ultimately want. One question I have for you, and I guess for the whole panel, I think a lot of these documentaries focus on underrepresented communities. And my question is, how do we make sure we're working with the community and not just for them from afar? Anyone can take this, but I'd be interested in hearing what folks think.
I'm happy to kick us off, and I will obviously advocate for the nutrition label because that is so important. That's why we love working with Kasia at Consumer Reports, and why we think adding labels to both data sets or whether it's IoT products are important parts of people understanding their privacy and security, and where we need to improve the actual products we're not only bringing into the world, but are impacting people. But when I think of how do we work with the community and not just for the community? I think so much specifically in the AI lens of public participation. There's a lot of frameworks around where it's saying if you are implementing AI or algorithms in your country, public participation is a really good node. And there are countries that have been doing a much better job at that than others have. And it's an important part of a technical revolution. And many countries have gone through processes that have looked very different, some really well, where they've actively worked with individuals in the country for them to understand what algorithms are, what AI is. And to work with those communities really involves them understanding how those systems work so they can move from a place of this thing is going to steal my job to this thing these are the skills I need to know in the future to be able to actually leverage my talent right now or the work I'm doing in a way that's meaningful or has impact. But also, like, when you think of with the community, it's hard to advocate for something you can't see and you don't understand. And that is crucial for us being able to work with them so that they can do that and then advocate with them. I do believe that people power is the greatest power in there, but that involves everyone coming along with you and all the people leveraging that form of power. And you can't do that if you're standing in the front waving your arms saying this is harming people I care about. It actually has to be all those people you care about as well saying, we're not going to use this corporation or this product until you all solve for the harm in here. And that's where we've seen the greatest lever of power. And that's why it's important to work with them instead of opposed to just for them.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to what Kasha was saying before about, hey, do you want to be tracked? Like, oh, I didn't realize this whole time I was being tracked. For the community question, yeah, what else do we think? Kasha, Abeba, what do we think? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything Amira said, and it's really important to work with the community through various mechanisms of participation. And the system you described is just perfect and ideal, Amira, but that doesn't exist, unfortunately. In fact, if you look at big corporations that are producing the biggest state-of-the-art, the most revolutionary, again, with a quotation mark, because there is so much misleading and overhyped when these models are presented. So keeping all that aside, what you find is not community participation, not working with the people where these products are supposed to be deployed. What you find is active exclusion of communities. What you find is active obfuscation of products, of data sets. Take a look at OpenAI. It's at the moment it's taking everybody by what's the expression? It's like it has become the most influential, the most talked about company with the production of the GPT family. But despite the name, they don't open anything. In fact, they are walking back slowly and retrieving access to anything they have opened up before. So if we can't look at their data sets, if we can't look at their models, if we don't know what's in the training set, if we don't know how the models are built, never mind participating in how their systems are built, we don't even have any knowledge. And this is what's happening at the moment. I think this is what we urgently have to change, because these models are not just remaining in their lab. They are not just like, intellectual play tools. These are tools that one way or another make it into the social system, into people. People are, for example, kind of fine-tuning and adopting some of the GPT models for providing mental health service, for example. And we know from a couple of months ago from a report that at least one person has died from a model that was supposed to help a mental health patient. In fact, the model encouraged that person to kill themselves. So what we find is we have these powerful companies producing tools that are then sold and that then make their way into society, but with no accountability. Never mind working with people. We don't even have access to their data set, to their models. So before we can even participate. So these are really important steps. These are really important things that we have to fight for, whether it's through regulation or whether it's through like raising awareness, such as through the documentaries. I personally think, these big corporations respond to outrage more than regulation. So awareness really is important. So yeah, we have a long way to work through that before we get to participation, community participation, and working with communities.
Okay, so everyone get your pitchforks out. We will ride at dawn. We will storm. Okay, so no, Bakasha, tell us what you think. I want to get your thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all fired up now. So thank you for that, Abeba. Whenever you want to go, just let me know. I'll be there. I think that absolutely there's a lot on the horizon with the generative or the frontier models or the foundation models, whatever you want to call them. I think that we also need to not forget that there's traditional AI that's already deployed, that will still be deployed, that still has issues that we still haven't fixed. And so we have to kind of split our focus a bit and think about what's coming up. And I agree with you that the centralization and the kind of monopolization of those foundational models in the hands of the same few who also got rich on the traditional AI, that's still problematic. And I think we also need to continue to focus on the existing problems and the existing kinds of more traditional data sets and AI systems that are in deployment, that are in production, right? That are already out there making decisions about public benefits and loans and, healthcare and all of these kinds of things. I guess maybe the one thing I can add really is that there are communities that are working very hard to rethink some of the structures around this. I think a lot about indigenous data sovereignty and some of the work that's happening in that realm. You have communities that were historically harmed, in particular in the healthcare domain, where data was extracted from communities, for the benefit of the communities, and then used over and over again in ways that definitely was not consentful. And there's been a lot of work to go and think about, hey, let's consider the building of these systems from the beginning. So, one thing that we've definitely seen with the nutrition label is that we've worked with data scientists and data curators who want to build a label after they've built the data set. That's great. But what you really need to do is consider the label and what's going to go into the label when you're building the data set, right? It should be a process that actually at the end of the process, what you end up with is a data set and a label, as opposed to something that you do after the fact. And I think these kinds of getting a little more diligent about these types of processes when you're finding the data, curating the data, and building the model and thinking of it as something that kind of rides alongside, as opposed to something that's done at the end, will help us a lot with a lot of the decisions that are made along the way.
Yeah, honestly, something I'm still stuck on is something you mentioned before about how you're piggybacking off of the work that we've seen in other fields with nutrition facts, nutrition labels, and this idea of don't ask to track me, I didn't realize you were tracking me. It is kind of a privilege just to have nutrition facts. I imagine there may have been a time where you buy a bag of Doritos, you don't even know what's inside this bag of Doritos. You just eat it and hope and pray. And it is, I take it for granted because all I've ever known is nutrition fact labels. But you're right, in a way, we don't have to have those. And there was probably a lot of work that came to get us to the point where every food has to have that transparency. And I think we will be able to get there with tech. I hope we can able to get there with tech.
I mean, and I think that there's something even deeper than you're kind of getting at it, which is that once the companies are required to have labels, the food gets healthier because they know they have to put a label on something. And if it's really, really terrible, that's going to be embarrassing for them. It's not going to be good for them in terms of public reputation and things like that. So number one, the food itself, right? The composition starts to change. And the second thing is that then when I walk into a bakery and I see something, that's been baked, it doesn't have a label slapped on it, but I'm thinking about health because now I expect that everything has health because I know that the other things have labels and that I'm aware of those categories of items. So it's shifting cultural norms, both on the production side and also on the consumption side. And that's kind of the tricky thing about the label, right? Is that it actually moves people and companies to do different things.
Yeah, and that's a good point because it tells you what questions you should be asking. You may not have the, sodium, fat, protein readouts on a baked good, but it tells you this is the thing you should look for: sodium, fat, protein, etc. I guess we're getting close to the end of the program, but there are some audience questions. I didn't want to ignore all the audience questions, so maybe I can take one of them here. We were talking before about how bias is just baked into everything that we make, and unfortunately, it's just because humans are humans. That's just how it goes. One question here is, how do we effectively handle different sources of biases? I think, Kasha, maybe you can answer that one. How do we effectively handle different sources of bias as we make tools?
Yeah, and then I would love to hear also what the other panelists think about this one. This is a tough one. I mean, I think that there have been a lot of categories or taxonomies of risk and harms that I've seen recently. A lot of people trying to categorize, hey, what is this type of harm or bias, and where can we look for it? I think there are, particular things that we can audit for. So I'd actually love to hear a bit more about the auditing process that Abiba, you go through. And I think that though at the underneath it all, I guess I could turn it around and ask a different question back, which is, how do we know what good looks like? And I think that a lot of the issue with identifying and mitigating bias is that we still haven't figured out as humans how we would fix those problems. So what would good look like? So if you actually think about different mathematical definitions of fairness, there are many different mathematical definitions of fairness, and you actually can't satisfy all of them at the same time. It's like mathematically impossible. And so we as humans have to look at the systems that we're building and say, what does fair look like in what situations? And then it's a little bit easier actually to build the systems that match our definitions. Like a good example of that might be if you have a data set. I'm very biased towards data, different kind of bias. But you have a data set that was collected entirely on one population in one area, looking at one health condition. And you now want to build a model that's going to predict that health condition for that population. The bias is that all the data comes from that population, but you're building the model for that population. That's probably okay. However, if you take that data and you go and you build this model for a totally different population in a way that, those differences are actually meaningful, let's say physically, that model is not going to do so well in that population. It's the same data set, right? So we have to think about what are the biases that matter and don't, for what we're trying to do. And then what's the right answer from a human perspective so that we can then encode that in the system. But I'd love to hear what my co-panelists have to say about that one as well.
Me too.
Yeah, I'll really quickly jump. This is why it's really important to talk about the precise problem as opposed to bias. If it's sexism, then we can go into data sets and tackle that. If it's racism, we can do the same. Whereas bias kind of, as I said earlier, really is just abstracts away the real concrete harm. And that actually happens on real concrete people. There is no one, bulletproof solution. If you think of data as representatives of people and cultures and identities and sexualities and so on, there are infinite numbers, and you can't list them all in order to address them all. There are the list is endless. But I guess when we go into the data set, you have to decide what kind of problems, what kind of discriminatory or harmful representations you want to investigate. You have to always narrow down your scope and look into that. And that's one approach I take as a data set auditor, at least. And generally, my principle, how where do we lean on, is we have seen again and again and again, when it is stereotypical representation, harmful outcomes, discriminatory outcomes, it's always people that are at the margins that end up being impacted the most. So my rule of thumb is, if we want to improve, the sexism, racism, or whatever other isms in the data set, we have to always necessarily adopt the perspective from that group. If that is, if a certain data set or if a certain model functions well and equitably for those that are at the margins of society, then it's likely to work for everybody. So that's generally my approach to this really difficult and very broad question.
That's a really good point. We have so many great audience questions, and I feel bad that we're running out of time. And we were pushing against the schedule right now, but I do still want to get in one more audience question. I'll just kick it out to everybody and see what folks think. So where can we see examples of companies doing it right? Maybe multiple companies collaborating to set standards. Anything come to mind there? Who's doing it well?
So I think I'll also very quickly say it's not companies. You don't see large companies doing this because it's against their very business model. It's against working equitable, responsible models. It comes as a trade-off. It will make you less profit, and you will just not be as influential. So not companies, but I think Kasia mentioned earlier the Maori community, the data sovereignty principles. You have other organizations like, Algorithmic Justice League, Data for Black Lives, led by Yeshe Mabet Milner. So these are not like large corporations, but these are organizations that are exemplar in working with data sets and models from with communities, with local communities, for local communities, along with local communities, as opposed to coming from the outside and imposing their models. So there are a number of them.
That's a very important distinction. Nobody else? Amira, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to add that like those are really important. But one of the things that I'm seeing a lot, even related to the question before this, is that there are so many different versions of standards and frameworks. So the bigger companies that are creating frameworks, creating standards, and what I hope we move towards is like some similar language that we can uphold across the industry. And so, I don't like highlighting one specific company that's doing right or what sort of standards they made, because those things are almost somewhat reactive as opposed to being proactive. And I think we need to determine proactively where that comes from and how that might adapt, given how data and biases will change to that previous question. And we're looking at the issues and knowing that so much of this is going to look different tomorrow, the next month, next year. What do we need to set in place? And then we need some sort of collaboration at a meta level, because right now you have different governments creating different things, sometimes just blocking versions of AI in general, until they figure out what they can do. You have companies creating a set of frameworks that they're abiding to, but then adapting. You have the public sector and nonprofits being like, we can create the right frameworks or settings. And I'm like, you all should just use the Data Nutrition Project. And that should be your framework and standards and settings. But it does add to a little bit of confusion on like, what is the best things and what are the best use cases? And I think there's a lot of really smart people saying some really great things. And what we probably want to do is like, how do we actually bring those conversations together and agree upon, here are the things we want to uphold. And with the change coming, here are the things we know that are consistent and where there is room to adapt.
Yeah, I can tell this group is a group where we could talk about this endlessly, but we are running out of time. So I'll just kick it to the last question. What is one takeaway you want to leave folks with on this topic? What is one final takeaway? Maybe we start with Abeba, then Kasia, then Amira.
One takeaway is there is so much hype when you hear about when a new model is released. You have to always question about the capacities and the capabilities of that model. And because when we dig into it, we find it's always over-exaggerated and it's presented in a misleading way. So just be cautious. There is so much hype around. That's I guess that's a burning thing, at least from my side of my corner of the AI world.
Yeah. Kasia?
Similar, I would say that everyone should be cautionary, but not with regards to the capabilities of the model, but rather not to assume anything. So don't assume that company is doing the right thing with your data. Don't assume that those developers tested that model. I spent like more than 15 years in industry building models. So like, don't assume. And I think everyone makes these assumptions. It's safe, it's tested, it's trustworthy. Don't make any assumptions and go investigate yourself or ask or dig, because you'll probably find that it's on shaky ground.
Yeah. Amira?
I just want to applaud to the last two because they were so great. I will say my one thing that I often like to say is these issues are not new. They are just supercharged by AI and algorithms and the way they're used even more. And so I think we need to get back to the root in a lot of these cases. But I will also say, if you go to badinput.org, you can watch the videos on there. There's conversation prompts. There's lots of petitions from the companies that we've talked and organizations we've talked about here, like Algorithmic Justice League's latest petition. Fight for the Futures, others. There's a link to Mozilla's Privacy Not Included guide. There's places you can take next steps. There's articles on which you can read more. And there's ways in which you can have the conversation and ask the right questions after watching those films. And so I would definitely recommend that to take as your next step.
I don't even need to wrap up the show because I think you just wrapped up the show for me. So I feel like we should leave folks on that note. Stay tuned to @Mozilla on social media for more general Mozilla updates, @Mozilla Festival on Twitter, where we announce future dialogues and debates just like this. Thank you so much to our panelists, Abeba, Amira, Kasha. Thank you so much to the folks behind the scenes, Andy, Ileana, Mark, Zaina, everyone. Thank you so much. And yeah, we'll talk soon more about topics like these. Hope everyone has a great day. See ya.
Thanks, Al.